All right, I'm joined now by Christian Pina of the Gambling Podcast. We're going to chat here about UFC on ESPN. Number one, Francis Ngannou, Cain Velasquez in the main event here. Christian, how's it going today, man?
Good, buddy. I feel like I start with the weather every time in Vegas, but I have to say, man, Valentine's and nature not cooperating, man. It is monsoon in Vegas, the better part of 2 months, and today's probably the worst day nonstop. So people coming out here for to bet on some college basketball or come to see, watch a UFC fight, all type of stuff, are going to be sorely disappointed, man. But the good news is we this card is absolutely stacked top to bottom. Really since the Cyborg pay-per-view fight, card wise, as really don't understand why this one truly wasn't there's not a championship fight really, so I get it why this wasn't quote unquote pay-per-view material, but I would pay for this card 10 out of 10 times over the especially with the main event being pulled of Whitaker with the hernia on last one. So this card leaps and bounds better and really a UFC pay-per-view worthy card.
Yeah, this card down in Phoenix, Arizona. And real quickly, for anybody that will be going out there next month for conference tournaments or March Madness, today, Thursday, when we're recording this segment, is the first day I realized that March Madness is not St. Patrick's Day weekend this year.
Oh, yeah.
It's actually the weekend after. So, another extra week for it to get warmer, and then you can go play blackjack in the pool at Caesars.
It's funny, man. I call it amateur hour. Sometimes it's the perfect storm. And I grew up in Gloucester, Massachusetts, just north of Boston, which is where the movie The Perfect Storm was. And that is the Las Vegas perfect storm of March Madness, conference tournaments, and St. Patrick's Day. So a little bit happy to see that is the case this year. There'll be less fighting and less puking in the streets, really.
Well, yeah, I mean, I would hope so. There will still be puking in the streets, as it's still true. Vegas. But, we'll probably talk about that next month, too, in terms of, you being somebody that's a transplant out there, talking about some of the places you like to go. But again, we'll do that next month here. But as you said, we got a pretty strong card here. We'll go ahead and start with the main event here of Ngannou and Velasquez. And Velasquez right now in the minus 160 range. But as you and I were talking before we started recording, this has come down a little bit.
Yeah, Ngannou was actually a little bit bigger price of an underdog, about the 160, 170, some shops peaking right in that range. And this fight is really, there's a lot of unknowns. And one of my golden rules is never bet on the unknowns. And with a guy like Ngannou, this is the epitome of you just don't know what you're going to get. The issue here is there's a large portion of the UFC community that believes that this is kind of the carbon copy of the Stipe Miocic fight with Francis Ngannou. And for anyone that's not familiar with that, effectively, if you can wrestle and take Francis Ngannou down, you're going to win the fight because he cannot defend that. That was the most one-sided title fight I can remember seeing. Aside from knockouts, fluke things like that, top to bottom. Pillar to post finish. That was the most dominating title fight I had ever seen in my life. And as a guy who has been the lead conductor on the Francis Ngannou hype train since his debut, it was really tough to see it. And you feel for a guy like that and what that did to him in his next fight, of course, coming out there. Against Derek Lewis and just not being able to throw a punch for fear of the takedown. And Lewis absolutely is not a takedown artist, had no plans to take him down. He was literally scared to death inside a UFC octagon and followed up the most dominating performance with the worst performance of his career. So back to back, the stock has never been lower on a guy like Ngannou to that point. Comes back in these 45 seconds and knocks out Curtis Blades. And all of a sudden people are, not really sure the type of fighter that Ngannou is. He has the most power in the UFC, the heaviest fists, hands down. And so that, that is always going to be a weapon for him. If you wrestle him, the cardio goes, and once that goes, the power is neutralized. The game plan from Stipe Miocic is going to translate unless he has, made these type of improvements. And if you read into fight camps and everything like that, the issue is you're never going to get a straight answer. No one's going to say, yeah, no, he still can't wrestle. They're saying all the right things. In interviews, he said, I've been well prepared. I'm not going to tell you the exact game plan, but we're going to have the same version of Cain. He still has the experience. He stopped the fight in his last fight, which again was over 2 years ago. Still has that confidence. So he, the narrative out of his camp is he knows that hole exists. And on the other side, you're getting a stock never been lower version of a price from the heaviest hitter in the division in Francis Ngannou. There's just too many unknowns. And again, speaking to the other side of a guy like Cain Velasquez, certainly one of the all-time greats inside the UFC. It's just there's a lot of red flags there, be it age, be it time off, layoffs. Is he the same guy? The USADA era. There's a lot more questions with him as well. I mean, he did end his last fight via knockout, but lost, the fight before that to Fabricio Verdum. So there's just a lot of questions surrounding this fight, and it's one of those fights that you take to your next fight because Ngannou may get another title opportunity if he is able to, get this win. If he's not, I don't see how the UFC can possibly risk either. The type of fights that he's been putting on was, billed as the most exciting fight of the evening last time out against Lewis, and it was an embarrassment for the sport. It was a black eye, and the same thing can be said for his last fight before that. So the stock is certainly low if you're willing to take that price. It's just there's a lot of unknowns on both sides for this main event.
So when you look at Velasquez here, and this is always a question I've had about UFC. I mean, more than 2 years of a layoff, as you mentioned. I guess obviously it's going to be on a case-by-case basis depending on the fighter. But with a guy like Velasquez, who's now 36 years old, how much does that layoff hurt him, do you think? Or does it help him?
Yeah. Again, like you said, it's case by case because this isn't, most fighters fight once a year. There are certainly the exceptions to the rules, the Donald Cerrones. And once you get up there in age, you see that, 14 months, 16 months. So it's not a huge red flag. And especially because of what happened there, it was a first round knockout in July of 2016 at UFC 200 prior, and again, before that lost a fight, so there's, when you're talking about a guy needing to heal up or a guy needing to fix the mental part of the game, like a guy like Francis Ngannou has clearly had to do it and did come back. It's case by case, but for a guy like Cain, it's not going to affect him a ton. Certainly you would like to see a little bit more just so you know the type of fighter that you're dealing with. But for a veteran like that who's been in the sport essentially since its inception, a 2-year layoff is not as big as an issue as it may seem at first glance.
All right, so as we look at this fight card out here in Phoenix, 2 lightweight fights here on the card, including the lead-in to the main event, James Vick, Paul Felder. I know this is one of your stronger positions here of this UFC on ESPN 1 card.
Yeah, really, when you look at this, I mean, again, talking about a guy in James Vick coming off a loss, and Paul Felder is basically has been known to really let down bettors. He just doesn't have the highest fight IQ. When you look at the whole, the game plans should I say this? The issues in the holes in each fighter's games, they're very different. Vic is limited by, size and things that you can potentially, fix when it comes to technique. Felder is fight IQ. And as we'll maybe talk about later, like I got Luke Sanders on this card as well. Fight IQ is the hardest thing to fix because essentially you're not thinking inside a UFC's octagon. You're reacting. Adrenaline is high, of course. And so mental mistakes and fight IQ is the hardest thing to fix. And a guy like Felder just has those mistakes and shows them time and time again to let down in spots. This line is, essentially a pick'em, which I do understand when you look at it from what I would call an X's and O's type of breakdown, being that neither guy is effectively, further along as a mixed martial artist. They have a lot of the same type of game plans and styles. Vic, 3 years younger, does have a height and reach advantage. Certainly the lankier guy, which is why he always has trouble, making weight and all that type of stuff. Vic is just, he's long been someone of mine that I feel has been constantly disrespected. Obviously kind of got into the spotlight and dropped the ball. And that's been known to happen inside a UFC's cage, from time to time here. I mean, Vic was humbled against Gaethje. I understand it. And it's just, there's no shame in that, despite the fact of Gaethje's troubles and there's been issues with both fighters. I really do understand that. When you don't want to underestimate Felder, it's just when you look at their game script, everything is crisper, everything is cleaner. And for my money, when there's a guy who constantly comes through as an underdog, that's where he was comfortable. And his betting lines were consistently in the plus 140 to plus 180, north of plus 200, and he routinely cashed. I believe there was a run he had a 91% win rate inside the UFC on a run of an underdog. And I believe he was the betting favorite in that fight against Gaethje or right around there. So I certainly understand that the propensity to recency bias is very real, especially in the UFC, because you don't know if somebody has turned a corner in a good or bad way. But fight IQ is something that is virtually unforgiving for me. And I just can't trust people with my money on that. And I know what I'm getting out of a guy like James Vick. He dropped the ball. He's very involved in the gambling community of mixed martial arts, which makes him a fan favorite. But at the end of the day, you look at his record, and the guy just wins. And a guy like Felder routinely drops the balls in these type of high level fights. So from a mental standpoint, I really like James Vick at this current price of essentially a pick -115 each way.
Something that jumped off the page to me about this UFC card here on ESPN, 4 women's fights, 3 of them from the strawweight division. Courtney Casey, Cynthia Calvillo, the one that's on the main card here for this one. 4 women's fights on one card does seem like a lot to me.
Yeah, it certainly is. And I think they're making up for some things because there really have not been a lot of women's UFC fights as of late. You can call that, the Van Zandt fight was there, of course. Cyborg Nunes was obviously the marquee event, but the UFC's division of women's is largely up and coming, as is mixed martial arts and women's as a whole. When we talk about betting angles inside this, as we record this, round props not really available, but effectively the reason that people don't love women's mixed martial arts is there's not finishing power when, the human body, a female human body, is constructed this way from 105 pounds and everything else all the way up. There's not a lot of strength in these punches. None of these girls are the elite mixed martial artists on the level of the males. That's just a fact. That's not sexist. That's not anything. It's just there only been, the inception of women's mixed martial arts has not been, they haven't had the same time to grow, and it's a different type of thing. It's just a little bit of a sloppier product, and most fights tend to go to decision just because, again, it's a little bit of a sloppier version of smaller mixed martial arts. There was a run in 2018 where virtually every women's fight was going to a decision, and you could print money with using open parlays that we talked about last week with over 2.5s. And the market really started to catch up towards the end of 2018. And when I speak about this, there was, the over 2.5 rounds for women's fights was usually like a -200, -180, -220. And once this run, which I believe was like 52-6, and it was even better than that if you take out, some showcase fights, a Cyborg, a Shevchenko massacre in there where she was, a -1000, where it was just a matter of time. Real women's fights that was, somewhat evenly matched was incredibly consistent going towards the over, and was able to do some things utilizing that to effectively string together these parlays, whether it was 2, 3, 4 fight parlays of over 2.5 rounds with women's, and it was just coming in all the time. The market really reacted, taking it to effectively like a -360 baseline for these type of fights now. So it's still very doable, especially if you do utilize an open parlay, or take a round robin or two, however you want to kind of string them together, because a -250, a -250 will still pretty good odds for a return on investment. But I think they're just kind of making up for kind of giving them a little bit of the shaft while they showcase the male talent to the new ESPN audience, to be honest.
So as you look at the 4 women's fights here, just on an overall basis, any of them interest you from a betting or a watchability standpoint here on this card?
I mean, honestly, there's no marquee fighters that I think that the casual fan would know. A Penny versus Escobar is really probably the worst one up there. There's, Escobar was a cautionary tale of believing hype from a camp, and heard coaches talked about how they've coached John Jones. She comes from a very good camp, and they talked about, out of everyone, including Jones, including all of these, well-known fighters, she's the most improved fighter they've ever seen. Came out there and got 30-26 and was really an embarrassment. And so that's, a cautionary tale for sure. That you need to watch out for, and you can never take a fighter's camp seriously. You kind of have to do your homework, whether it be social media or all that type of stuff. Albu, Whitmare, there's really not a ton on here. Obviously, the most well-known one is going to be the Calvillo fight up there, just because it's on the main card. So I think that'll have the most eyes on it. But truthfully, there's, in Colorado, there's not a ton to go over here from a betting perspective. Again, round props certainly still not out yet. Bottom line is both women are attempting to break into the title here, and Calvillo was nearly in line for a title shot, got upset to Carla Esparza. People they go back and forth on a girl like that. And Casey in a similar position, just outside the top 10. These girls, I should say, are really just jockeying for a position here in something of a mundane type of UFC's division for this. And both fighters, I keep saying guys, both women need to make improvements. Certainly, there's not going to be the marquee fighter that comes out of this card, I think. So from a betting perspective, again, I've certainly been doing this for a long time to string together a few over 2.5s for women's fights, and the plan's not going to change here. But betting angles for these type of women's fights, not a lot on here. A lot of them are very untrustworthy, and they're just jockeying for position in that 10 to 15 to 20 range.
So as I mentioned, what jumped off the page to me here, the 4 women's fights, something that jumped off the page to you, the line for the Caceres-Gracie fight, which is in the featherweight division, right before that last of the women's fights. What is it that's so surprising to you here?
So when you look at a guy and you look at this type of lines, again, Kron Gracie has the famous last name, right? I think people are going to, of course, gravitate that Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. Here's the deal. It's great to have a guy like this on the roster. Should he be a minus 330 favorite? No. Gracie is a submission killer. And so stylistically, he's really being set up to come away with a win here because Caceres' kryptonite has always been his submission defense. This one could be over kind of quickly, and I may look, kind of silly saying this. This is more of a principle type of, bet selection of you just can't lay this type of chalk on a unproven guy. It comes in time and time again. Bilotov again at the plus 35. We see it time and time again when there's unproven fighters. Gracie primarily was a kickboxer, Muay Thai, submission type of fighter in Japan. Japan is somewhat notorious for having crooked judges throwing fights. There's a lot of that in the mixed martial arts scene of Japan. He's beaten virtually nobody. And so to come in here and at least have a guy who's a UFC caliber fighter in Caceres, it's a little bit disrespectful. I understand it because they effectively gave Gracie the fighter with the worst stylistic matchup for him to try to get him a, flashy submission, take the back or whatever the case may be. They want to certainly elevate him because he is fun to have on the roster. He does crazy submissions, crazy knockouts. He's just has not fought anyone yet. He's as raw as they come. So, on principle, if you see this and you're thinking just throw it in a parlay, chances are it probably hit, but over the long term, it will hit for this specific type of matchup. Over the long term, you shouldn't get in the habit of just being quote unquote lazy with it without doing homework and looking at that. He's a very unproven guy. The bright lights have never been this bright inside the UFC's octagon. And again, use this as a stepping stone. The price is pretty much unbettable anyway. Watch the film from this, see what you can gather about his game in the UFC, and either, bet on or bet against if you see this again, because again, you're betting at certainly the top of the market just because it's a great stylistic matchup and he has a great name. So just something of a cautionary tale here.
When you look at Gracie and you look at the history for this fighter, a lot of jiu-jitsu competitions and things of that sort, a lot of grappling stuff, only 4 mixed martial arts fights, including one against Tatsuya Kiwajiri, which he did win. But what does that mean to you? The fact that there is some professional experience here from a grappling standpoint, just not really MMA.
Yeah, and it's what does he want to prove, right? Is he all in? Those are type of things that you don't know unless you're in a fighter's camp or you're the fighter himself. Does he just want to prove that he is the best jiu-jitsu artist in the world? Go, a couple fights above 500, cash a paycheck. He certainly has the talent to coast and make a lot of money in this sport. We have to see what his striking and what his wrestling is like. This is a type of fighter that is elite at, jiu-jitsu and submissions. Elite. However, the other stuff is not proven it. And to be a world-class, champion, again, you need to be well-rounded. And again, certainly this stylistically is not the type of opponent that's going to exploit the holes. I don't believe. He certainly, again, does have some, experience. I'm not trying to discount that at all. It's just it's never UFC type of experience, which you've seen time and time again is a very different animal for these fighters coming over.
One more fight I want to touch on here on the main card, then we'll sort of bounce around with some of the other things that you like. This Vicente Luque Brian Barbarina fight. Barbarina more than a $3 dog here. And as you and I were talking before we started recording, there's always something interesting about Brian Barbarina fights. There's always something compelling about them.
And Brian Barbarina is, like you said, compelling. He is a junkyard dog. He is very endeared to UFC bettors because he will fight to the death for your money. He is consistently somewhat disrespected in the betting market, and he is a knockout artist, as is Luque. This is effectively two guys probably most likely going to stand and bang till one guy falls, which is the type of fight that the UFC wants to endear to the casual fan. These guys have 17 combined knockouts out of 32 men's, and out of 32 of both of these guys wins. Luque's only lost his last 8 fights. Was currently the number 9 Leon Edwards. Lost a decision, but he looked pretty good in doing so. He's finishes in 7 before that, effectively splitting them between knockouts and submissions against names that we've talked about on the show: Bilal Muhammad, Laprice, those type of guys. And Brian, effectively, Luque is the slicker guy. He's better all around talent. But when you look at a guy like Barbarina, there was a time going back in his last fights against guys like Ellenberger, where they were really decision type of, where would his career kind of go, and consistently comes in as, the underdog with no respect and gets the job done in what people feel is fluke fashion, because he's effectively a knockout artist. And so things may look a little bit more fluky. You don't know if somebody was setting things up. You don't know that type of thought preparation. So Dad Bod Barbarina is a term of endearment in my eyes when it comes to him. He's always capable of the finish here. But when we talk about paths to victories, Luque has more. Barbarina, it's going to be by knockout. I'm not sure if you're going to get much value if you want to play a Barbarina by knockout prop specifically. It's probably not much different than the price on the straight up bet of Barbarina. But Luque has just more paths to victory. He can point fight. He can style. He can knockout, of course. And again, 3 out of 7 finishes, effectively split 4 knockouts, 3 submissions. So he just has more tools, but that has never stopped a guy like Barbarina before. So he's just kind of someone who's much like a Darren Elkins on my do not bet against list.
All right, so as we look at the rest of this card here, and we already touched briefly on the 2 women's fights on the early prelims, so mostly just looking at the remaining men's fights. Anything else stand out for you here on this card?
Again, as we tape this, round props really not out at this point. But on the prelims, I think that there's a fight that bears some value for underdog bettors: Benito Lopez and Manny Bermudez. Manny Bermudez minus 200, Benito Lopez plus 170. Bermudez is, effectively called the Bermuda Triangle, finishing all of his fights by that famous triangle submission. The guy is, on the surface, when you look at things, a submission killer, much like a guy like Kieran Gracie. When you dig a little bit deeper, this is kind of the paradox with a guy like this. Is he well-rounded and he's just getting these submissions because that's his go-to? Are they flukes? What's kind of going into this? When you look at the quality of opponent in the UFC that he's been given, it is not great. This was a very hyped prospect coming in from an outside organization, effectively was given the bottom of the UFC's roster to look good against, and he did exactly what they wanted him to do, which was go to his namesake, the Bermuda Triangle. He came into the UFC with that nickname. It's not as if just because of these last 2 triangles that he's gotten this nickname that he was always somewhat famous for. Is he well-rounded is the issue. So in other words, my concern with a guy like this, much like a guy like Ngannou, is with one-trick ponies, what happens when that one trick isn't available? If Bermudez isn't able to get the submission, what is going to be the outcome here? And so when you really break this down, you have to look at the fights prior to see, was he losing on judges' scorecards? Was he winning? And it was just a formality. And so what type of situations go into this? If Bermudez is not able to improve the other areas of his game, specifically striking, effectively everything else besides takedowns and submissions, Lopez is going to be his biggest challenge to date, certainly. And at the price doesn't make a lot of sense here. I would have this lined at effectively a pick'em. This is the biggest step up from Bermudez, effectively not fighting what we call a gas can in the UFC for the first time. And this is going to be the time. Certainly, Bermudez is one of the most skilled submission artists in the UFC. That option is always, that avenue is always going to be something fearful if you bet against a guy like that. I just don't think it's going to be as easy. And Lopez certainly has the skills on the feet. He's the most well-rounded fighter Bermudez has come across. Certainly after 2 straight submissions, this is going to be a point of focus for the Lopez camp. I would just be very weary if Bermudez can't get that submission. I don't know what can happen, but I do know that Lopez has effectively all the other tools in the arsenal. So at plus 170, certainly worth a little bit of an underdog price there.
Christian Pina, you can read his UFC on ESPN 1 preview over at BangTheBook.com, where he goes a little bit more in-depth on some of the other fights that are on the board. And, obviously a great read each and every week and a very good addition over at our website. You can follow Christian on Twitter at Christian Pina, Pina, and of course, check out his gambling podcast as well. Christian, appreciate the time as always, man. Thank you so much, and we'll talk to you again in anticipation for the next event next week.
Sounds good, man. Talk soon. Great luck. Good luck this weekend.